Yeah, but you know, I wasn't really during those times. I wasn't really searching it because I got to tell you, you do a series, you do. Back then, we doing 40 shows a season. That's a long time, and you do that for a long time.
He was the $6 million man. She was the most iconic face of the 1970s. Together, they were Hollywood's golden couple, until everything fell apart. At 86, Lee Majors finally broke his silence, revealing the emotional wreckage behind his picture-perfect marriage to Farrah Fawcett. What started with love ended in betrayal, heartbreak, and a silence that lasted for decades. Why did Lee never forgive her? What happened behind the cameras that the public never saw? In this video, we reveal the full painful truth, from their whirlwind romance to the devastating moment that changed him forever. The golden couple that wasn't. In the 1970s, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were the couple everyone admired. He was Colonel Steve Austin on The $6 Million Man, a stoic hero with superhuman strength and every kid's favorite action figure. She was the stunning Texan blonde with the most famous smile in America. To the public, they were perfection. Their faces lit up magazine covers, their hands held tightly on red carpets, and their love story seemed as tailor-made as a Hollywood script. But behind those flashing cameras and posed photos was a relationship already beginning to crack. They met in the late 1960s, two rising stars on very different paths. Lee, born Harvey Lee Yeary, had already found steady work in television with The Big Valley and was praised for his quiet charisma. Farrah, a Texas-born beauty queen, was just beginning her journey in Los Angeles, catching attention with her sun-kissed hair and girl-next-door charm. Friends said the chemistry was immediate. Lee was steady and reserved, Farrah full of life and optimism. They complemented each other perfectly, or so it seemed. By 1973, they were wed, and for a time at least, it seemed a fairy tale. Lee got the role of a lifetime as Steve Austin and rocketed to TV superstardom. Suddenly, he was everywhere. Lunchboxes, trading cards, Saturday morning cartoons. His career had never been better, and he was boasting about Farrah, who was now moving away from commercials and modeling into serious acting work. He called her the love of his life, and the two of them were a reflection of that. But after the wedding, things began to change almost immediately. With Lee working grueling hours on the set of one of television's most physically demanding shows, and Farrah busy networking and auditioning, and continuing to build her own brand, there was rarely an overlap in their schedules. What looked effortless in public was exhausting behind closed doors. The demands of Hollywood began to pull them in opposite directions, and the distance wasn't just emotional, it was actual. They were ships that passed in the night, seeing less and less of one another with every passing month. Lee was traditional by nature. For him, it was dinner at home or time set aside for each other. He wanted connection, stability. Farrah, meanwhile, was discovering a whole new kind of ambition. Not just a star's wife, but someone who wanted a career of her own. And while there was a public show of support from Lee, the reality behind the scenes was complicated. Fame was starting to muddle their dynamic. By the 1970s, Farrah was beginning to crack good. Shampoo commercials, photo shoots, and interviews faces were familiar, and producers took note. Lee, still achieving prominence with the $6 Million Man, looked on with a mix of pride and unease at her metamorphosis. For he had been there when the world would know how fickle fame could be, how it could isolate, distort, and magnify even the most benign of personal differences. But Lee held on. He believed in the marriage. He believed in her. He kept trying to work it out, trying to keep them grounded. But slowly, the very thing they had both worked so hard for their careers was becoming the thing that ripped them apart. And nothing was known. Their red carpet smiles remained. Their interviews were light through loving and playful. Behind an emotional agony, there was an ever-expanding chasm. But in front of the cameras, they were still Hollywood's golden couple. But their love wasn't just strained by fame, it was eventually shattered by something far more personal. When fame becomes a wedge. In 1976, Farrah Fawcett didn't just get her big break, she became a cultural phenomenon. The day she debuted on Charlie's Angels, everything changed. Overnight, she went from recognizable to unforgettable. The show was a runaway success, and Farrah quickly became its breakout star. Her face was everywhere. Billboards, calendars, late-night talk shows. But no image captured her rise more than one single photograph. Farrah in a red one-piece swimsuit, hair wind-blown, smiling effortlessly. It sold over 12 million copies and became the most iconic poster of the decade. She wasn't just a rising star anymore. She was a symbol, the face of the 70s. And while millions of fans were captivated by her glow, the rapid ascent of her fame came at a cost, especially to her marriage. Lee Majors watched his wife change right before his eyes at home. By then, he was a star for years because of the $6 Million Man, and he knew the grind of the industry. But nothing prepared him for the speed with which Farrah was rising and the volume of work that was being thrown at her. Suddenly, she was working every hour of the day. Commercial endorsements, magazine spreads, award shows, and fashion deals. It was once Lee who was the more famous one. Now he was becoming Farrah's husband. Admiration transformed into growing distance. The woman who once depended on Lee was now in charge of an empire, while Lee, constrained by traditional values, began to feel that he was existing in a different world from that of his relationship. The two met infrequently. He was filming, she was filming, and their calendars could just never align. At one point, we were told that Lee asked if her team could perhaps rearrange Farrah's schedule so that they might have dinner together a few nights a week. A very simple request for a husband to make of his wife. Farrah simply would not accept it. She was not about to weaken herself. Her star was on a fast track, and she was determined to walk all the way on her own. That insistence on independence was soul-searching into the very emotional seat that held them together. Lee began to feel more and more like a third wheel, not just a spouse, but a partner. He confessed later that at one point during the height of her fame, he only saw Farrah 2 days a week. Even those moments felt snapshot-like, more business than pleasure, devoid of intimacy. It was not that Farrah had cooled. She was still warm and still kind. But that woman Lee had married, the grounded Texas girl with big dreams, was now someone else. Not maliciously, just different. Fame's machinery engulfed anything else. She had to perform, build her self-image, and keep moving. And, once her grounding force, Lee was now a stranger waiting on a slice of her time. For Lee, the hardest thing about the fame was not fame itself. It was what fame stood for. The change in priorities, the loss of connectedness, the sharing of a life together. And perhaps most cruelly, he watched it happen in public. Every time he opened up a magazine or saw one of her commercials, there she was, perhaps not with him. She was on the television, MIA, present but distant. The emotional distance was only the beginning, because Lee never saw the real betrayal coming. the affair that broke him. By the late 1970s, Lee Majors and Farrah Fawcett were no longer living like husband and wife. Though still legally married, their lives had diverged completely. Two separate orbits, spinning at different speeds. Lee was focused on maintaining his TV stardom with the $6 million man, while Farrah was being swept into a global spotlight that few could survive, let alone navigate without collateral damage. Their emotional connection, once so vibrant, had withered into something distant and mechanical. They weren't fighting, they were simply no longer connecting. And then, it all imploded. The final blow didn't come from another fight or career misalignment. It came from a headline. Farrah Fawcett had been seen with another man, Ryan O'Neal. And not just any man. Ryan was a fellow actor, a major Hollywood name in his own right, and someone Lee had once called a friend. Their circles had overlapped for years, and Lee had never suspected that Ryan would be the one to step into the wreckage of his marriage. But he was. And worse? The world found out before Lee did. Photos of Farrah and Ryan holding hands, smiling at public events, and walking arm in arm began flooding magazines and tabloids. What was once a personal crisis was now entertainment for millions. Lee didn't get a warning. No phone call, no explanation, just glossy images plastered across newsstands. To the rest of America, it was a juicy celebrity scandal. But to Lee, it was a betrayal that hit every nerve. Friends say that Lee was completely blindsided. It wasn't simply infidelity, but public infidelity. The shame of seeing your wife, still legally your partner, wrapped in another man's arms for the whole world to see. Even worse, some insiders speculated that the relationship with Ryan may have begun while Lee and Farrah were still attempting to sort things out between themselves, but that's always been a bit hazy in terms of timing. That ambiguity did nothing to lessen Lee's heartbreak. What made it forgiven was the personal dimension of Ryan's part in Lee's life. This was not some random stranger, not some unknown name. This was someone he had let into his world, a peer he had respected, a betrayal layered with familiarity, sharp, deeper, and more personal pain. Farrah has never refuted this association. She and Ryan were frequently together, without a doubt, and almost instantaneously, the press proclaimed them the latest it couple. But behind that new chapter is a man left behind, one who quietly tried to save his marriage, only to be publicly and unceremoniously replaced. For Lee, the sting wasn't merely emotional, it was existential. Everything he believed about loyalty, love, and trust had suddenly turned upside down. Neither did he lash out at life, nor press release, nor pen a scathing tell-all memoir. His actions, however, spoke louder than any public statement could. Lee withdrew completely. He stopped coming to all the events with Farrah. Quit talking to the media about private matters. Eventually, he ceased mentioning her altogether. His silence was not indifference, but heartbreak. A deep, private heartbreak, not needing audience. From then on, Lee Majors was but a man who left to go away from that which he could not try to redeem anymore. All that pain went into work, with appearances in The Fall Guy and other reliable television projects. But those close to him knew it. The kind professional Lee would respond without pretense, though he did not do so with freedom as he did before. Farrah, meanwhile, moved on with Ryan O'Neal, whose relationship would become just as stormy as her marriage had been. They became newspaper regulars, with groans and moans recorded incessantly. But the one person who refused to participate in the drama was Lee Majors. He stayed silent. Not because he didn't have anything to say, but sometimes the loudest grief doesn't speak. From then on, Lee Majors was but a man who walked away from that which he was no longer able to try to redeem. All that pain went into work, with appearances in The Fall Guy and other reliable television projects. But those close to him noticed the change. The kind, professional Lee would respond without pretense, though he was not free to do so previously. Farrah, meanwhile, moved on with Ryan O'Neal, whose relationship would become just as stormy as her marriage had been. They became newspaper regulars with groans and moans recorded incessantly. But the one person who refused to be part of the drama was Lee Majors. He stayed silent, not because he didn't have anything to say, but because sometimes the loudest grief is the one that says nothing at all. After the headlines faded, Lee made a decision that stunned Hollywood. He vanished from her life completely. Silence as a form of survival. After the heartbreak, after the betrayal, and after the media circus that turned his private life into a public melodrama, Lee Majors disappeared from Farrah Fawcett's world, entirely and deliberately. In a town built on headlines and exposés, his silence was radical. While others would have jumped at the chance to tell their side, to reclaim dignity, or simply to cash in on public curiosity, Lee did the opposite. He went quiet, and he stayed that way. Their divorce was finalized in 1982, nearly 9 years after their wedding. By then, Lee had already stepped away emotionally. He was done being a character in someone else's story. His focus shifted back to work. He took on roles in television movies and shows like The Fall Guy, which ran for several seasons and kept his name relevant. But behind the scenes, those close to him said he was never quite the same. Always Lee was described as very calm, polite, even-keeled. After his marriage, however, he got a little more distant, honorable, but somewhat guarded. Yes, he dated, but never in a very serious way. He had his share of admirers and offerers, but nobody went quite to the threshold of Farrah. Friends observed that Lee would professionally smile during interviews, but his energy felt different. He lost not just a woman, but also the faith he had in the ideals of love. In contrast, it was Farrah who pursued her public image, her love life with Ryan O'Neal, always a thrash of scandal. They separated, united again, had cruel battles, and made up while the public watched. So, her emotional highs and lows turned out to be unverified entertainments. She was as unedited as Lee was private. It only emphasized their differences further. Lee's silence towards the outside world of all recognitions of their common past was one among the strongest signs of his being hurt. Charlie's Angels had reunions, but he wasn't there. Farrah had her appearances, but somehow he didn't catch anyone's eye. Not even at the background. This was mistaken by some as coldness or bitterness. But that wasn't revenge, it was protection. Protection from reopening a wound that had never really healed. In a rare interview some day after, when asked if he had ever watched Charlie's Angels at the time, Lee simply replied, "No, it was too painful." Not angry, not dramatic, just honest. It hurt too much, seeing her on screen, what they had shared, how it had come to an end. What makes Lee's silence stand out is the steadfast and unbroken nature of that silence. He never wrote a tell-all. He never went on TV talk shows to air grievances. He never pointed a finger at her, not even in the most subtle way. In an industry that manages image from left to right and sells personal stories for profit, he chose dignity. He let Farrah move on. He stepped out, not for the reason that he didn't care, but because he cared too much to be a part of it. Friends say he mourned privately. The pain was real and lasting, but with an inner resolve, he accepted that their story was over, and any attempt to tread back into it would only cause further damage. He built a wall around that chapter in his life, never allowing it to be distorted, slimed, or revisited for public consumption. Then, decades later, a quiet opportunity arose. A possible reunion that could have rewritten their story. The meeting that never happened. Years passed. Farrah Fawcett's career softened into something more reflective, more personal. She was no longer the explosive force that had once dominated every television screen and magazine cover, but she had settled into a different rhythm, focusing on art, charity, and smaller acting projects. Lee Majors, too, had matured into a quieter phase of life. No longer the action hero heartthrob of the 1970s, he remained active in television, but carried the calm and caution of someone who had seen what fame and heartbreak could do. And then, out of nowhere, a chance for closure emerged. In the early 2000s, a mutual friend of the former couple reportedly reached out to both Lee and Farrah independently. The suggestion was simple: a private meeting. No cameras, no reporters, no stage. Just two people with a shared past sitting down, perhaps for the first and last time, to clear the air, to laugh, maybe even to find peace after years of silence. Farrah was open to trying. Once, she had loved Lee profoundly. Time and circumstance had torn them apart, but she had no ill will. Many of her feelings had faded with time, and she began to think more generously of what she considered the good old days, before the fame, before the headlines. She wasn't interested in reconciling with him, but rather some sort of clarity, some sort of humanity. Lee's thoughts were more complex. He listened, thought, and later, to himself, admitted that a part of him missed who she used to be, not the poster child or the celebrity, the Texas girl who lit rooms without even trying. But all things considered, he said no. It is not from hatred, or even bitterness, just finality. Already too much happened, too many things unsaid. And sometimes it's true. If you leave a wound long enough, reopening it even with kindness could hurt worse than keeping it closed. For Lee, silence had become a kind of survival. Farrah's presence again might have brought resolution, or ripped wide all old scars he had stitched into private history over decades. He didn't want to risk it, so that meeting never took place. That moment never came. Those two people who had once meant everything to each other never sat down to make sense of what went wrong. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was just two different styles of coping. Farrah, always open, expressive, and bold in her vulnerability. Lee guarded, cautious, and deeply private. Before long, not long after that missed opportunity, it occurred the diagnosis of cancer for Farrah occurred. The disease advances very quickly so that any prospect of a revival soon faded into the background. Lee never reached out. Lee never sent any message, never said a word. Some people think this rather cold. Others know what he has had burdened all these years. That was the only thing he could do. Because for Lee Majors, it was not merely avoiding pain by not looking back at the past. It was preserving some purity, the memory of who she had been before everything went sideways, before the treachery, before the silence, before Hollywood swallowed whole. This quiet refusal spoke volumes more than any interview could have. He wasn't trying to erase her. He was trying to protect himself from reopening a book he had never truly finished reading. With Farrah's illness deepening, time began to run out. Marking the beginning of the final chapter, neither of them would get to write together. Watching her fade from afar. In 2006, the world learned something heartbreaking. Farrah Fawcett had been diagnosed with a rare and aggressive form of cancer. It sent a wave of shock through Hollywood and across the nation. The woman once known for her radiant beauty and unbreakable charisma was now facing a brutal, unforgiving fight. And in true Farrah fashion, she chose to meet it head-on, publicly and without filters. She documented her journey in raw, emotional video diaries that would later become part of a televised documentary. There were no glamorous makeovers or filtered footage, just Farrah facing mortality with vulnerability and courage, showing the world what strength really looked like when the cameras were no longer flattering. Her decision to go public wasn't for sympathy, it was for honesty. She wanted to use her platform to show the reality of cancer, to educate, to strip away the illusions of fame, and remind people that even icons bleed. The accolades flowed forth from fans as Farrah stood before the world, naked in her rage. The one who was not present, Lee Majors. There were no sound bites or interviews. He had not been anywhere in public, not for a charity event, not for a word on air when the documentary aired. Lee remained in the wings, mute and invisible when normally he would have been expected to appear. Not that he did not care. Nothing could be further from the truth. According to those who knew him best, he was following every report, every update, every single day from the moment she was diagnosed. But he did it quietly, so as to be unseen, shouldering the burden all alone. He had been hurt deeply. He would joke to friends. Her illness had reopened wounds, wounds not of romance, but of emotion. The ability to say, "I love you," with the other part of him, never turned completely to stone. Reaching out would mean stepping back into a space he had purposely exited. For years, silence had shielded him. And now, in the midst of Farrah's final battle, he just couldn't find his way, or the strength to vault that emotional canyon. Not anger, but the opposite. Fear at tearing down any shadow of the hard work to move on. So he mourned from a distance. When she died on June 25, 2009, at the age of 62, the media started pouring in with tribute upon tribute, retrospects and retrospects. From Charlie's Angels, the first of its kind, to her high-profile fight against cancer, she was all beauty, strength, and defiance. The celebrities reminisced. The networks aired specials and interviews. Fans lit candles and flooded the internet with their old photos. But Lee? He put out a single line. She fought a tremendous battle against a terrible disease. She was an angel on earth, and now an angel forever. Respect is one thing, poise is another. But this is nothing less than painful restraint. No funeral, no memorial speech. Some thought he was distant, others thought he was cold. But it was, in the minds of those who really knew Lee, just a part of his way of grieving. Farrah was already gone for him long before she was gone in life. For him, having to return and face the world with cameras and flashing lights would have been a mockery of the silent suffering he endured over the years. Lee Majors had a life with her, to love her through her rise, to help her during her transformation, and to watch as she came undone emotionally. When it was all done, he chose to carry on in silence. In silence, he lost her. But even that brief statement carried weight, because it revealed just how deep the heartbreak went. A love that never left. After Farrah Fawcett's death in 2009, much of the world moved on. Her legacy was honored in retrospectives, her career examined through the lens of pop culture history, and her final battle remembered as a public act of courage. But for Lee Majors, the story didn't end with her passing. In many ways, it never truly ended at all. By the early 2000s, Lee had created a new chapter for himself. In 2002, he married Faith Majors, a woman far removed from the frenzy of 1970s Hollywood. It was a quieter life, one built on mutual respect, privacy, and stability. Everything his relationship with Farrah had lacked. The two shared a different rhythm, and by all accounts, their marriage brought Lee a sense of peace he hadn't known since before the cameras and tabloids had turned his personal life into a national spectacle. But Farrah's memory did persist. It was still there with that new life. She had been his first great love, the woman he thought he would live out his life with. And, painful as the years had been, distance and silence in between, there was always a corner in his heart that had been carved out just for her. To Lee, there was never the urge to capitalize on their history. He did not want to sell the story. He did not want to use the past to get his name back into the tabloids. He did not even want to mend or change the narrative. He preserved it very quietly, very privately, and in his way. And on the rare occasion that he was ever asked about Farrah, over the years, he has always spoken of her with dignity and restraint, using only the most polite and carefully considered words. But time, as it is wont to do, softened the edges of that heartbreak. And at 86, a little while later, when he was asked once again to speak about his ex-wife, the lady who had delighted him and wreaked havoc in his heart, Lee Majors let slip the soft truth behind the armor. He never really stopped loving her. It was hardly a grand revelation. It wasn't really meant for the headlines. He would say, to close acquaintances, that this was the most vulnerable ever he had been about her. He had to admit that their saga wasn't ending up quite as he intended. They never went into the closure process, never had the final conversation, and never reconciled. Love, connection, and the piece of his heart she carried, those had never left. Farrah had turned his world upside down. From brilliance to ambition to the whirlwind rise, an inspiring challenge, a challenge in his own right. The betrayal hurt, and the silence that followed was also necessary, but it was the hallmark relationship in his life. Not that it lasted, but that it mattered deeply. It is not often that you will witness a love story in Hollywood without any whispering, loud public rants or revenge. Just two people once everything to each other, fame, fear, and choices only they could undo. But there is something achingly beautiful in Lee's quiet reverence, his lifelong refusal to badmouth her. In life, in absence, in pain, and in death, Farrah was forever in his life. There were no last embraces, no dramatic reunions, and certainly no tabloid last-minute reconciliations, just memory and love. An intricately layered, unfulfilled, but unforgettable love that sculpted the two lives, intertwined long after the spotlight on them had dulled. In the end, Lee Majors didn't have to say much. He never really did. His silence, distance, and few words throughout the years gave way to the absolute truth. There isn't any way you can forget this woman might actually be the same woman he'd never stop loving. Even in the stillness of his later years, Lee Majors carried Farrah Fawcett with him, not as a ghost of regret, but as a quiet echo of something once luminous. He never sought to rewrite the past or chase what might have been, but in the privacy of his heart, the memories stayed vivid and intact. It wasn't nostalgia for fame or beauty. It was something more elemental, the imprint of a bond forged before everything fell apart. Lee Majors never gave the dramatic interview, never wrote the tell-all. But in the silence, in the restraint, the truth still emerged. A heartbreak that shaped his entire life. What do you think was left unsaid between them? Could things have ended differently? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and watch the next video for more untold stories from Hollywood's golden age.